Vampires. The word alone conjures images of pale, fanged creatures lurking in the shadows, drinking blood and defying death. But why do these beings, some centuries old in folklore, continue to captivate our imagination? What is it about vampires that makes them both terrifying and strangely alluring? The answer lies in a combination of fear, fascination, and a reflection of our deepest human desires and anxieties. The fascination with vampires isn't a modern invention. Long before Hollywood gave us Bela Lugosi or Anne Rice, humans were creating stories to explain the inexplicable. In Eastern Europe, particularly in the Balkans, villages would experience mysterious deaths, sometimes sudden illness, sometimes plague, and the victims' bodies would appear strangely preserved or disturbingly swollen. People didn't have microscopes or germ theory. To them, it looked like the dead were rising, feeding on the living. These early stories laid the foundation for the vampire myth, blending fear of disease with fear of death itself. But vampires are not just a European phenomenon. Variations of vampire-like creatures appear across the globe. In China, there were the Jiangshi, hopping corpses that drained life energy instead of blood. In Africa, some legends tell of the Asesabonsum, forest-dwelling creatures with iron teeth that preyed on humans. Even in South America, indigenous stories warned of spirits that consumed the blood of livestock and humans alike. Across continents and cultures, humans have used vampires as a way to explain the unknown: why crops failed, why children died, why sickness struck. Part of the vampire's enduring appeal is psychological. Vampires embody immortality and power, but they also reflect human fears: death, disease, and loss of control. They are creatures of the night, representing the unknown and the forbidden. When we read a vampire story or watch a movie, we are drawn to this mix of fear and desire. The vampire is often a mirror, its immortality a reflection of our yearning for life, its predation a reminder of mortality. Historical events have also reinforced vampire myths. In the 18th century, during outbreaks of plague in Eastern Europe, communities performed rituals to prevent the dead from rising. Bodies were exhumed, stakes were driven through hearts, garlic was hung in homes, and the suspected vampire was decapitated. Newspapers and official records from the time describe villagers' fear in meticulous detail. Some historians believe these accounts were a mix of superstition and social control, a way for communities to make sense of mass death. Literature then immortalized the vampire in a more sophisticated, sometimes seductive form. Works like John Polidorus' The Vampire 1819 and Bram Stoker's Dracula 1897 took the terrifying folkloric vampire and gave it elegance, intelligence, and charisma. Suddenly, the vampire became not just a monster, but a character capable of complex motives and relationships. This evolution in literature transformed vampires from objects of fear into figures of intrigue, romance, and even rebellion. Culturally, vampires also serve as symbols. They can represent societal fears: disease, invasion, or moral decay. They can symbolize forbidden desire, power dynamics, and the tension between life and death. Their ability to walk among humans while remaining fundamentally different makes them perfect metaphors for the outsider, the predator, and the immortal. This duality, fear and fascination, repulsion and attraction, is central to why vampires continue to captivate audiences across generations. In today's world, vampires have evolved further. From Gothic literature to blockbuster films and young adult novels, they are reimagined in countless ways, but the core themes remain: immortality, power, danger, and the seductive allure of the unknown. Their stories continue to explore human psychology, societal fears, and cultural norms, keeping the myth alive and relevant. In conclusion, vampires fascinate us because they combine the primal fear of death with the seductive promise of power and immortality. They appear in every culture, evolve with time, and reflect our deepest desires and anxieties. Understanding their origins, evolution, and symbolism allows us to see why, centuries later, humans are still drawn to the shadows where the vampire waits. In the next chapter, we will explore vampire legends from around the world, uncovering stories as diverse and strange as the cultures that created them. Vampires are not just a European invention, their shadows stretch across continents and centuries. While most people immediately think of Dracula or Transylvanian legends, nearly every culture has imagined creatures that feed on the living in some form. Exploring these global myths reveals not only fascinating stories, but also insights into human fear, imagination, and the ways societies explain the unknown. In Eastern Europe, particularly in the Balkans, vampire folklore is the most detailed and influential in Western culture. Villagers believed that after death, some bodies could rise, drain the life of their families, and spread disease. To prevent this, communities performed elaborate rituals, exhuming bodies, placing garlic or holy objects around the corpse, staking the heart, and sometimes decapitating the suspected vampire. In Poland, Serbia, and Romania, such practices were recorded in parish records and local chronicles, showing how seriously people took the threat. These legends also serve social purposes, helping communities enforce moral behavior by labeling outsiders, criminals, or antisocial individuals as vampires after death. Moving eastward, Russia had its own vampire traditions. The Upir was a creature that could leave the grave to haunt the living, often associated with unbaptized children or those who had lived sinful lives. The Upir was believed to spread sickness and death. People used charms, incantations, and physical barriers to protect their homes and livestock. Interestingly, these beliefs coexisted with Orthodox Christianity, blending spiritual ideas with folklore. In China, vampires took a very different form. The Jiangshi, sometimes called the hopping vampire, is a corpse reanimated through spiritual disturbances or magical practices. Unlike the European vampire, the Jiangshi absorbs chair or life energy rather than blood. The legends describe stiff, pale figures moving with jerky hops, arms outstretched, often wearing traditional Qing dynasty garments. Villagers would use mirrors, roosters, and Taoist talismans to repel them. These stories reflect a cultural focus on balance between the living and spiritual realms, rather than just predation. Across Africa, vampire myths often intertwined with shape-shifting and witchcraft. The Asesabonsum, from West African folklore, is described as a forest-dwelling creature with iron teeth and hook-like hands, attacking humans who stray too far from safety. Some communities attributed mysterious deaths or illnesses to such entities, combining supernatural fear with practical caution about dangers in the wilderness. In southern Africa, legends of Sangama's traditional healers sometimes included warnings of blood-drinking spirits or witches disguised as humans, further reinforcing societal norms and taboos. In South America, indigenous myths spoke of spirits or demons that consumed blood or life force. The chupacabra, though a more modern legend, continues this theme, attacking livestock and spreading fear of the unknown. Earlier pre-Columbian stories also included entities that drained vitality or fed on dreams, showing that the concept of life-consuming creatures existed long before European contact. Even in North America, Some Native American tribes had stories of spirits that preyed on humans in ways reminiscent of vampire legends. These beings often served as moral lessons, the consequences of greed, disrespect for nature, or violation of sacred spaces. Unlike European vampires, these creatures were less about undead horror and more about reinforcing cultural values and survival strategies. Despite these variations, common threads emerge: the fear of death, disease, and the unknown, the idea that the boundary between life and death is fragile, and the use of rituals, charms, or moral codes to protect the community. Vampires often appear where humans feel powerless against illness, natural disasters, or social chaos, offering a narrative framework to explain tragedy and enforce societal norms. The global diversity of vampire myths also highlights human creativity and adaptability. Each culture molds the vampire to reflect its unique environment, fears, and values. European vampires emphasize blood, morality, and the undead. Asian vampires focus on spiritual energy and cosmic balance. African and South American myths blend predation with moral lessons and survival advice. Together, they show that vampires are universal symbols of fear, mortality, and the desire to control or explain the uncontrollable. In conclusion, vampires are far more than a single story from Transylvania. From the Balkans to China, Africa to South America, humans have imagined creatures that prey on life, reflecting culture, psychology, and environment. These myths not only entertained, but helped societies understand death, enforce morality, and survive uncertainty. In the next chapter, we will dive into historical cases of real vampires, examining panics, recorded exhumations, and the chilling ways communities confronted the undead in reality. While vampires are often seen as creatures of folklore and fiction, history shows that belief in them was very real and very serious. Across Europe, particularly during the 17th and 18th centuries, communities panicked over mysterious deaths, sudden illnesses, and the fear that the dead could return to harm the living. These episodes reveal not only superstition, but also how societies attempted to explain the unexplainable. One of the most famous examples occurred in Krajan, Serbia, in 1725. Villagers reported that a series of deaths seemed unnatural. Corpses appeared to be well preserved, with fresh blood visible, and some claimed they had seen the dead wandering at night. The local priest and townspeople, convinced of vampirism, exhumed the bodies. They drove stakes through the hearts, burned the flesh, and scattered the ashes to ensure the dead could not rise again. Newspapers and official reports at the time documented the panic, showing how seriously authorities and communities took the threat. In Eastern Europe, similar events were common during outbreaks of disease. When plagues, smallpox, or tuberculosis swept through villages, people often sought supernatural explanations. If multiple members of a family fell ill, villagers might suspect the deceased had become a vampire. In some cases, entire cemeteries were disturbed, with corpses being staked, decapitated, or burned. Records from Poland, Romania, and Russia show detailed accounts of these interventions, blending religious rituals, folklore, and what we might today call epidemiology. A particularly chilling case comes from Gomel, Russia, in 1772. After a series of sudden deaths in a small community, a local priest identified a young man who had recently died as the source of the problem. Villagers exhumed his body, which appeared unusually preserved, and performed rituals including staking, burning, and placing garlic in the grave. Reports indicate that panic and fear gripped the town, with families acting out of both desperation and devotion. These events illustrate how belief in vampires could could transform a community's behavior, turning grief into action and fear into ritualized violence. The reasons behind these panics were not purely superstition. Before modern medicine, people had no understanding of how diseases spread. Tuberculosis, for instance, could kill multiple family members over months, and the bodies of victims sometimes appeared bloated or discolored, a natural result of decomposition. To villagers, these signs were evidence of the supernatural. By performing protective rituals, they believed they could prevent further deaths. In essence, vampire hunts were an early form of crisis management, albeit one guided by myth rather than science. In Germany and Austria, cases of vampirism led to legal proceedings. Courts sometimes allowed exhumations and posthumous punishments to appease terrified communities. One case in 1730 describes a man accused of becoming a vampire post-mortem. Authorities permitted a stake through his heart, followed by burning his remains. Such cases show the intersection of folklore, religion, and law, how belief in vampires could influence social order and judicial decisions. Vampire panics also reveal a fascinating social dimension. Often, those accused were outsiders, criminals, or people who had lived unconventional lives. By labeling someone as a vampire, communities could enforce social norms and marginalize perceived threats. The vampire became a scapegoat, embodying both moral failure and existential fear. It was a way to explain tragedy, assert control, and maintain communal cohesion. Interestingly, these historical cases fed back into the literary imagination. When John Polidori wrote The Vampire in 1819, and later Bram Stoker penned Dracula in 1897, they drew on folklore, eyewitness accounts, and documented panics. The terrifying reality of human belief made fiction all the more compelling. Readers were aware that while vampires might be fantastical, communities had genuinely feared and fought them, a perfect blend of history and horror. In conclusion, historical vampire panics remind us that fear shapes behavior in powerful ways. Villagers, priests, and even courts acted decisively to confront perceived threats, using the tools available to them: ritual, religion, and folklore. These stories, strange as they may seem today, illustrate how humans cope with the unknown, merge myth with reality, and create narratives that endure for centuries. In the next chapter, we will explore the vampire in literature, tracing its evolution from terrifying folklore to the charismatic, complex figure that dominates modern fiction. By the 19th century, vampires had made the leap from folklore and fearful superstition into the realm of literature. This transition marked a turning point. No longer were vampires simply monsters lurking in villages or graveyards. They became complex, often seductive characters that could captivate and terrify readers simultaneously. The literary vampire bridged myth and modern storytelling, combining horror, romance, and social commentary. One of the earliest literary vampires was John Polidori's The Vampire, 1819. Polidori, a physician and contemporary of Lord Byron, crafted a tale about Lord Ruthven, a mysterious aristocrat preying on the living. Unlike folkloric vampires, Ruthven was intelligent, charming, and socially adept. He infiltrated high society, seduced women, and left ruin in his wake. Polidori's vampire reflected the anxieties of the upper class, the fascination with power, and the fear that evil could lurk beneath refinement and elegance. The story was groundbreaking because it transformed the vampire into a social predator, capable of psychological manipulation, not just physical attack. But it was Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, that solidified the vampire as a cultural icon. Count Dracula combined folkloric roots, Eastern European superstitions about revenants, with sophisticated Victorian anxieties. He could shapeshift into a bat or wolf, control minds, and spread his influence over large distances. Stoker's genius was in creating a character that was simultaneously terrifying and alluring, embodying forbidden desires and societal fears. Dracula represented both sexual danger and aristocratic predation, a creature whose immortality highlighted the fragility and mortality of human life. The popularity of Dracula was fueled not just by the horror, but by the atmosphere. Stoker meticulously researched Eastern European folklore, geography, and historical figures, creating a sense of authenticity. He blended letters, diary entries, and newspaper clippings to create a modern, immersive narrative. Readers of the time were fascinated not only by the supernatural elements, but by the realism woven throughout the story. Dracula felt like a creature that could exist if only in the shadows of Europe's forests and castles. Between Polidori and Stoker, a series of literary vampires emerged, each reflecting the concerns of their time. Le Fénis Carmilla, 1872, introduced one of the first female vampires, blending Gothic horror with themes of forbidden sexuality and transgressive desire. Carmilla's predation was intimate and psychological, preying on the young women she encountered. Her presence raised questions about gender, power, and societal repression. The story also laid the groundwork for later explorations of romanticized vampires, showing that bloodlust could be intertwined with emotion, passion, and seduction. Vampires in literature became mirrors for human anxieties. During the Victorian era, industrialization, urbanization, and shifting social norms created both fascination and fear of the unknown. Vampires embodied these tensions. They were outsiders, predators, and immortals moving among humans. They could seduce, corrupt, or destroy, representing both moral and existential threats. At the same time, they allowed writers to explore desire, longing, and rebellion against social constraints. This duality, terror and attraction, became central to the vampire mythos in fiction. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw vampires evolve further in pulp fiction, newspapers, and stage adaptations. Writers experimented with combining horror, romance, adventure, and psychological depth. Vampires could be tragic figures, cursed by immortality, or cunning manipulators, thriving in a world that feared and admired them simultaneously. Each iteration added layers. Some emphasized their monstrous nature, others their seductive charm. By the time Hollywood began adapting these stories, vampires had become multidimensional symbols, capable of inspiring fear, fascination, and empathy. It is also important to note the connection between literary vampires and cultural fears. Count Dracula represented foreign threats and aristocratic corruption in a rapidly globalizing world. Carmilla explored anxieties about female sexuality and transgression. Vampires, in literature, were often outsiders physically, morally, or socially. They revealed the tension between civilization and instinct, control and desire, life and death. Reading these stories, audiences engaged with their own fears, moral dilemmas, and fantasies, safely exploring what society labeled taboo. In conclusion, the literary vampire transforms centuries of folklore into art, psychology, and cultural commentary. From Polidori's charming predator to Stoker's aristocratic menace, from Le Fénis' intimate terror to the countless adaptations that followed, vampires became more than monsters. They became mirrors of human society, emotion, and imagination. In the next chapter, we will explore how cinema took these literary creations and expanded them, turning vampires into enduring icons of the screen. capable of evolving with each generation's fears and desires. If literature brought vampires into the minds of readers, cinema brought them to life before our very eyes. Film transformed the vampire from a creature of imagination into a visual and emotional experience, capable of terrifying, seducing, and captivating audiences across generations. The story of vampires on screen is also a story of changing cultural fears, technological innovation, and evolving notions of morality and desire. The cinematic journey began in 1922 with F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, a German silent film loosely based on Bram Stoker's Dracula. Count Orlok, with his rat-like features, elongated fingers, and shadowy presence, was a far cry from the suave, aristocratic Dracula most readers imagined. Murnau's genius lay in his use of shadows, lighting, and camera angles to create a sense of dread. Orlok was not just a vampire, he was a visual embodiment of plague, fear, and death, reflecting post-World War anxieties and the lingering trauma of the Spanish flu pandemic. The film proved that vampires could terrify as much on screen as in text, making the unseen horrors of folklore visible in a way that left audiences unsettled. Hollywood soon followed, with Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Count Dracula in 1931 becoming iconic. Lugosi's heavy accent, piercing gaze, and dramatic gestures defined the cinematic vampire for decades. Unlike Nosferatu, Lugosi's Dracula was elegant, charming, and seductive, a predator cloaked in sophistication. This vampire was both alluring and dangerous, a reflection of cultural fascination with aristocracy, foreign influence, and sexual tension. The success of the film established tropes still seen today: dark castles, hypnotic stares, and the tension between predator and victim. Over the decades, vampire cinema evolved. The 1950s and 60s saw Hammer horror in the United Kingdom, where actors like Christopher Lee brought muscularity, romance, and violence to the vampire. These films emphasized eroticism, blood, and gothic spectacle, blending horror with melodrama. The vampire became increasingly symbolic, a creature of forbidden desire, a mirror for repressed fantasies, and a dramatic tool for exploring social taboos. The themes of immortality, predation, and seduction were amplified on the screen, captivating audiences with both fear and fascination. In the 1980s and 90s, vampires took on new forms. Films like The Lost Boys, 1987, and Interview with the Vampire, 1994, combined horror with contemporary culture, youth rebellion, and moral ambiguity. Vampires were no longer confined to castles. They moved through cities, nightclubs, and suburban streets. They were seductive rebels, sometimes sympathetic anti-heroes, exploring identity, loneliness, and the consequences of eternal life. Here, the vampire myth began to reflect modern anxieties, alienation, desire, and the tension between freedom and responsibility. The 21st century brought another transformation. The Twilight Saga and other young adult adaptations reimagined vampires as romantic figures, struggling with morality, love, and identity. Vampires were no longer only predators, they were protagonists, capable of compassion, heroism, and emotional complexity. While critics debated the literary and cinematic merits of these portrayals, there is no doubt they revitalized vampire culture for a new generation, blending gothic horror with teenage romance and supernatural adventure. International cinema contributed unique perspectives as well. Japanese films like Shiki 2010 and South Korean productions often explored vampires as social metaphors, blending horror, folklore, and commentary on mortality, illness, and societal tension. These adaptations highlight the global fascination with vampires, demonstrating how flexible and culturally resonant the myth has become. The evolution of vampire cinema mirrors society's changing fears and desires. Early films reflected anxiety about disease, death, and foreign influence. Mid-century films explored sexuality, rebellion, and moral transgression. Modern adaptations emphasize identity, morality, and romantic longing. In every era, vampires serve as mirrors, showing what society fears, desires, and struggles to understand. Cinematic vampires also rely heavily on visual and auditory techniques to create tension. Shadows, music, costume design, and cinematography work together to elicit fear and fascination. The contrast between light and darkness, stillness and sudden movement, silence and sudden sound all heighten the sense of dread. The vampire's presence on screen is both literal and symbolic, representing death, desire, and the unknown simultaneously. In conclusion, vampires in cinema transformed myth into a visceral experience, from Nosferatu's horrifying silhouette to Twilight's brooding romantic figure. Films have reimagined and expanded the vampire, reflecting societal fears, desires, and fantasies. Cinema allowed audiences to see, hear, and almost touch the vampire, creating legends that endure in the collective imagination. In the next chapter, we will explore the science behind vampires, examining diseases, psychological phenomena, and natural explanations that may have inspired these enduring myths. While vampires have long been creatures of myth and literature, science provides fascinating insights into how these legends may have arisen. From mysterious diseases to unusual physical conditions, there are plausible explanations for why humans historically believed in undead blood drinkers. Understanding the science behind vampires doesn't diminish their allure, it adds a layer of intrigue, showing how fact and folklore often intertwine. One of the most discussed conditions linked to vampire myths is porphyria, a group of rare genetic disorders affecting the production of heme, a component of hemoglobin in blood. Certain forms of porphyria can cause extreme sensitivity to sunlight, leading to blistering or lesions on exposed skin. Historical accounts suggest that sufferers may have avoided daylight and displayed pale, reddish-tinged skin traits commonly attributed to vampires. Additionally, some forms of porphyria can cause gum and teeth discoloration, further fueling the association with blood consumption. While modern medicine can manage the condition, for villagers without understanding of genetics, it must have seemed supernatural. Another medical explanation involves rabies, a viral disease that affects the nervous system. Rabid individuals may exhibit hypersensitivity, aggression, and excessive salivation, combined with nocturnal activity. Since rabies often makes sufferers irritable during the night, this could have contributed to vampire-like behaviors in infected people. Even the fear of being bitten, which could transmit the disease, parallels the folklore of vampires spreading death through blood. Decomposition of corpses also played a significant role in early vampire panics. Before refrigeration, bodies sometimes bloated after death, and blood could appear at the mouth or nose due to natural processes. In communities unfamiliar with decay, this was interpreted as evidence of the dead feeding on the living. A family seeing their recently deceased relatives seemingly fresh and bloody could easily conclude that a vampire was among them. These natural phenomena reinforced fear, superstition, and ritualistic behavior. Beyond diseases and decomposition, psychological phenomena also contributed. Conditions like sleep paralysis, where a person wakes but cannot move, sometimes experiencing hallucinations, were often explained as attacks by nocturnal spirits or vampires. Night terrors and vivid dreams could make individuals believe they were being drained of life while asleep. strengthening cultural myths. Fear, imagination, and communal storytelling amplified these experiences, embedding them deeply into folklore. Nutritional deficiencies might have also played a part. For example, anemia causes paleness, weakness, and fatigue. Communities witnessing individuals with unusual pallor or lethargy may have linked these traits to supernatural causes. In societies where medical knowledge was limited, unexplained physical symptoms were often interpreted as signs of vampirism, reinforcing rituals such as staking or the use of garlic to repel the afflicted. Vampires also intersect with the study of epidemiology. In times of plague, tuberculosis, and smallpox, high mortality rates and sudden deaths created panic. Communities often sought supernatural explanations, including vampires, to account for the rapid spread of illness. Exhumations and rituals weren't mere superstition, they were attempts to control a crisis, to impose order on chaos. These actions, though based on misinterpretation, demonstrate the human drive to find cause and effect in a dangerous world. Interestingly, modern science also shows that vampire behavior drinking blood is not entirely imaginary. Hematophagy, the consumption of blood for sustenance, occurs in many species, including bats, leeches, and certain insects. While humans are not naturally hematophagous, historical accounts sometimes describe practices that resemble blood drinking rituals for medicinal, religious, or symbolic purposes. These practices could have influenced the development of vampire legends, merging biological observation with myth. Finally, vampires can be viewed as metaphors for a human obsession with immortality and vitality. Science provides tools to understand life and death, but it also highlights human limitations. Legends of blood drinking, eternal life, and nocturnal power may reflect not only fear, but also a deep desire to transcend mortality. In this sense, vampires sit at the intersection of biology, psychology, and culture, a mirror reflecting humanity's fascination with life, death, and the unknown. In conclusion, science helps demystify the vampire while enriching its allure. Porphyria, rabies, decomposition, sleep disorders, and epidemics all provide plausible explanations for centuries of vampire belief. Yet, the myths persist because they resonate on a symbolic level, exploring fears, desires, and the mysteries of life and death. In the next chapter, we will examine vampires as symbols of power, sex, and immortality, revealing why these creatures continue to captivate human imagination beyond the literal and the medical. Vampires are more than monsters. They are mirrors reflecting the deepest desires and fears of humanity. Across literature, folklore, and film, vampires embody not only death and danger, but also power, sexuality, and the tantalizing promise of immortality. Understanding this symbolism helps explain why humans remain fascinated by these creatures. Centuries after the first legends emerged, one of the most prominent themes is sexuality. From Bram Stoker's Dracula to Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, vampires are often depicted as irresistible and seductive. This is no coincidence. Vampire stories often explore forbidden desire, the tension between societal norms and primal urges. The act of biting penetrating the skin, drawing blood is inherently intimate, creating a metaphor for sexual consumption and transgression. In Victorian England, where social mores were rigid, the vampire's seduction represented both fear and fantasy, the terror of unbridled desire, and the thrill of breaking social conventions. Power is another central motif. Vampires are often aristocratic, commanding, and nearly invincible. They wield influence over the living, sometimes controlling minds or bending wills. This mirrors human fascination with dominance and control, as well as fear of manipulation by those more powerful. In literature and film, a vampire's charm and intellect are just as threatening as its fangs. Count Dracula, Lord Ruthven, and even modern cinematic vampires like Lestat are embodiments of authority and charisma. Their power is seductive because it is absolute, unrestricted by morality, mortality, or societal rules. Immortality is perhaps the most alluring trait of the vampire. Humans have long feared death, and the vampire offers a tantalizing, if powerless, alternative. Immortality in vampire fiction is double-edged. Eternal youth, knowledge, and experience are balanced by isolation, loneliness, and moral consequences. Characters like Louis in Interview with the Vampire exemplify this. He gains centuries of life and perspective, yet suffers perpetual loss and existential anguish. Vampires allow audiences to explore the fantasy of eternal life while grappling with its inherent costs. Vampires also symbolize the outsider. They straddle the line between human and monster, belonging neither fully to society or entirely to nature. This liminality resonates across cultures, representing social anxieties, xenophobia, and the fear of the other. The vampire's nocturnal existence, ability to hide in plain sight, and predatory nature mirror societal concerns about infiltration, corruption, and hidden threats. At the same time, the vampire's outsider status makes it a vehicle for exploring freedom, rebellion, and alternative identities. Another layer of symbolism lies in psychological projection. Vampires embody repressed fears and desires. In folklore, they punish transgression and punish sin. In modern media, they represent suppressed sexual longing, ambition, or curiosity. They act as safe vessels for exploring taboos, biting, blood, and immortality, but just horror elements. They are conduits for examining human nature, morality, and the tension between instinct and civilization. Interestingly, vampire symbolism changes with historical context. In periods of political instability or social upheaval, vampires often represent external threats or internal decay. In the Victorian era, they mirrored anxieties about sexuality and morality. During the 20th century, they reflected youth rebellion, social alienation, and the consequences of indulgence. Today, vampires can symbolize anything from emotional isolation to elite dominance, depending on the storyteller and audience. The vampire's duality, terrifying and alluring, makes it a perfect archetype for exploring contrasts, life and death, morality and desire, power and vulnerability. The act of feeding is both destructive and intimate. The promise of immortality is both seductive and damning. Vampires exist in the liminal spaces of human consciousness, where fear and fascination collide. In literature, film, and folklore, vampires function as cultural barometers, revealing what a society fears, desires, or cannot articulate openly. They are metaphors for the unknown, death, disease, forbidden love, and moral transgression. At the same time, they satisfy the human craving for adventure, danger, and the ultimate escape from mortality. In conclusion, vampires are symbols that transcend simple horror. They embody sexuality, power, and the tantalizing promise of immortality, while reflecting human anxieties and desires. Understanding this symbolism allows us to appreciate why vampires have remained central to storytelling for centuries. In the next chapter, we will examine modern vampire subcultures, where these myths and archetypes are lived out in real communities, role-playing, and contemporary fascination. Vampires have long existed in the realms of myth, literature, and cinema, but the fascination with the undead did not stop there. In the modern era, vampire subcultures have emerged around the world, transforming folklore into lived experience. These communities, whether based on aesthetics, lifestyle, or metaphysical beliefs, demonstrate how deeply the vampire myth continues to resonate and how adaptable it has become to contemporary society. One of the most visible forms of modern vampire culture is the lifestyle vampire community. Members often adopt the aesthetic and habits associated with vampires: dark clothing, fang jewelry, nocturnal routines, and a fascination with gothic literature and music. For many, it is about identity, self-expression, and belonging. Gothic clubs and events provide social hubs where enthusiasts gather, sharing stories, music, and rituals inspired by their favorite vampire myths. These gatherings often emphasize creativity, art, and performance, turning the vampire persona into a lifestyle choice, as much as a fascination with the supernatural. Beyond aesthetics, some individuals identify as real vampires, claiming to require energy from others to maintain health or vitality. This energy is usually conceptualized as psychic or life force, though some also practice sanguinarians, who consume small amounts of blood consensually. Communities of real vampires often have strict ethical codes emphasizing consent, respect, and safety. They distinguish themselves from fantasy role players by insisting that their practices are spiritual or metaphysical rather than mere performance. Anthropologists and sociologists have studied these groups, noting their complex social structures, rules, and rituals, which mirror aspects of historical folklore in a modern context. Vampire role-playing is another thriving subculture, particularly among younger generations. Online communities, conventions, and live-action role-playing LARP events allow participants to immerse themselves in vampire narratives. These games often blend mythology, literature, and pop culture, creating elaborate societies with clans, hierarchies, and codes of conduct. Players explore morality, power dynamics, and social interaction within the safety of fictional or semi-realistic frameworks. Role-playing provides not only entertainment, but also a medium to explore identity, creativity, and interpersonal dynamics. Interestingly, modern vampire subcultures also intersect with technology and media. Social networks, forums, and video platforms allow enthusiasts to share experiences, rituals, and advice globally. Gothic and vampire aesthetics influence fashion, music, and even interior design. Streaming series, films, and games continue to shape community norms, blending fiction with real-world practice. In this way, digital culture perpetuates and expands the vampire myth, making it accessible and participatory for millions of people. Psychologically, participation in vampire subcultures can serve several purposes. For some, it is a way to assert individuality, embrace nonconformity, or challenge societal norms. For others, it provides a framework to explore sexuality, desire, or personal power in a controlled and consensual environment. The vampire identity can also offer comfort, a sense of belonging, meaning, and connection to something larger than the mundane world. Modern vampire culture demonstrates how myths evolve to meet the psychological and social needs of each generation. Ethical discussions are central within these communities. Rules regarding consent, health, and personal boundaries are taken seriously, especially in practices involving blood or energy exchange. Communities often hold educational workshops, social events, and mentorship programs to ensure newcomers understand the responsibilities associated with vampire practices. This blend of ritual, ethics, and social cohesion reflects how folklore is translated into contemporary culture, maintaining the symbolic essence of the vampire while grounding it in real-world ethics. Across the globe, vampire subcultures are as diverse as the myths themselves, from North American nocturnal communities to European gothic circles and online forums spanning Asia and South America. These groups demonstrate that the vampire legend is not confined to history books or fiction. It thrives in lived experience, creativity, and social identity. The vampire continues to captivate not only through fear and desire, but through active participation, embodying centuries of myth in the modern world. In conclusion, modern vampire subcultures illustrate the enduring power of the myth. Vampires are no longer confined to castles or graveyards. They inhabit clubs, forums, and communities worldwide. They represent identity, creativity, and a fascination with immortality and power, while maintaining ethical codes and social structures. In the next chapter, we will explore the legendary methods of hunting and protecting against vampires, from folklore to superstition, revealing how societies attempted to defend themselves from these immortal predators. Throughout history, humans have sought ways to protect themselves from vampires. From Eastern European villages to Asian folklore, societies developed elaborate methods, rituals, and tools to combat these feared creatures. These practices were often a mix of superstition, religious belief, and early attempts at explaining natural phenomena, reflecting the deep human desire to control death, disease, and the unknown. In Eastern Europe, where vampire legends were most prevalent, protection rituals were detailed and methodical. Villagers believed that staking a vampire through the heart would prevent it from rising. Stakes were often made of wood, sometimes sacred, and driven with force through the chest or heart. In some regions, garlic was hung in windows or worn around the neck, believed to repel vampires with its pungent odor. Water, salt, and iron were also commonly used, as they were thought to have purifying or protective properties. These practices were not just magical, they provided a tangible way for communities to assert control over fear and death. Exhumation rituals were another common approach. Villagers would dig up graves of suspected vampires, observing the body for signs of life after death. A body that appeared unusually preserved, had blood at the mouth, or seemed swollen was often deemed vampiric. Measures included decapitation, burning, or even reburial with heavy stones or chains to prevent the corpse from rising. While gruesome, these actions were logical within the belief system of the time and often aimed at protecting the community from further deaths. Religious symbols played a crucial role in vampire protection. Crosses, holy water, and sacred texts were believed to ward off the undead. Priests or shamans often led rituals to bless homes, graves, and fields, combining spiritual authority with local superstition. The integration of religious practice reflects how societies fused faith and folklore to confront mortality and perceive supernatural threats. In Asia, protective methods varied but were equally intricate. For example, in Chinese folklore, charms and talismans were used to prevent the jiangshi, or hopping vampire, from attacking the living. Taoist priests would inscribe spells on paper and affix them to doors or graves. Mirrors, rooster feathers, and other symbolic items were believed to repel these creatures, demonstrating a cultural emphasis on spiritual balance and the prevention of supernatural disruption. Africa and South America also had unique approaches. Communities would create talismans, perform ritual dances, or rely on spiritual leaders to protect against blood-drinking entities. These practices often reinforced social cohesion, ensuring that community members followed established moral codes and respected the supernatural forces that were believed to govern life and death. Interestingly, many vampire protection methods served practical purposes. Garlic, for instance, has antimicrobial properties and could help prevent infections in stored food or homes. Iron tools were durable and could secure doors or graves. Rituals that brought communities together provided social support during crises like disease outbreaks or famine. In this way, folklore and superstition were intertwined with survival strategies, blending the supernatural with everyday life. Vampire hunting also became ritualized in literature and media. From folklore collections to Gothic novels, the image of the vampire hunter armed with stakes, holy symbols, and determination emerged as a cultural archetype. Figures like Van Helsing in Bram Stoker's Dracula symbolize human ingenuity and courage, blending science, religion, and folklore. These fictional hunters reflect societal anxieties while offering a template for confronting fear, methodical, knowledgeable, and morally justified. Even today, vampire hunting exists in symbolic forms. Modern subcultures and role-playing communities recreate these rituals, blending historical accuracy with performance and imagination. This continuation demonstrates the enduring fascination with the theme of protection, the desire to confront mortality, and the thrill of ritualized action against an immortal foe. In conclusion, hunting and protecting against vampires was historically more than superstition. It was a way for humans to assert control over death, disease, and the unknown. Whether through stakes, garlic, talismans, or religious ritual, societies developed methods that reflected both their beliefs and practical needs. These practices influenced literature, cinema, and modern subcultures, preserving the vampire hunter archetype as a symbol of courage, morality, and human ingenuity. In the next chapter, we will explore the enduring legacy of vampires, examining why these creatures remain central to global culture, storytelling, and imagination. Vampires have captivated human imagination for centuries, and their influence extends far beyond folklore, literature, and cinema. They are cultural icons, symbols, and metaphors, reflecting society's fears, desires, and evolving values. From ancient legends to modern subcultures, vampires remain a potent and flexible motif that continues to inspire, terrify, and fascinate. One of the key reasons for their enduring legacy is adaptability. Vampires have survived because they evolve with each era. In folklore, they represented fear of disease, death, and the unknown. In literature, they embodied forbidden desire, social anxiety, and moral transgression. In cinema, they became visual icons, blending horror, seduction, and spectacle. Modern subcultures interpret vampires as symbols of identity, creativity, and personal empowerment. Each generation reshapes the vampire myth to reflect contemporary fears and fantasies, demonstrating their remarkable cultural resilience. Vampires also endure because they address universal human concerns. Mortality, power, sexuality, and social belonging are central themes in human life. Vampires embody these issues in heightened, dramatic form. Immortality represents the ultimate desire to escape death, while the vampire's predation reflects anxieties about control, invasion, and vulnerability. Their duality, terrifying yet alluring, destructive yet charismatic, allows audiences to explore complex emotions safely through narrative, performance, or role-play. The vampire's influence is evident across media, literature, film, television, video games, and even music frequently draw on vampire imagery and themes. From Gothic novels to blockbuster franchises, vampires appear in stories that range from horror to romance, comedy to action. Their symbolic versatility allows creators to address issues as diverse as sexuality, identity, morality, addiction, and power dynamics, Whether a vampire is a villain, hero, or anti-hero, the archetype resonates because it reflects core human experiences in amplified form. Vampires have also become global cultural icons, bridging geography and language. Legends that originated in Eastern Europe have been adapted in Japan, North and South America, Africa, and beyond. Each culture reinterprets vampires to fit its own mythology, values, and fears. Japanese adaptations may focus on spiritual energy and balance, Western narratives on sexuality and immortality, while African and Latin American stories often emphasize morality, social cohesion, and survival. This global spread underscores the vampire's universality. They are flexible mirrors reflecting both shared human concerns and local cultural context. Another reason vampires endure is their capacity to challenge social norms. In fiction and subcultures, vampires often exist on the margins of society, flouting rules and expectations. They question authority, explore forbidden desires, and live outside conventional morality. Engaging with vampires allows audiences to safely confront taboo topics and explore alternative identities. In modern media, vampires often function as metaphors for marginalized groups, outsiders, or misunderstood beings, providing commentary on social inclusion and exclusion. Vampires also thrive in interactive culture. Role-playing games, cosplay, online communities, and themed events allow individuals to inhabit the vampire persona. Participants explore themes of power, desire, and identity in immersive ways, creating a living, evolving vampire mythology. This interactivity ensures that the legend remains active, participatory, and relevant, rather than confined to the past. Finally, the vampire persists because of its psychological resonance. Fear, fascination, and desire are universal emotions, and the vampire embodies all three. They offer a safe space to explore mortality, moral choice, intimacy, and power. They remind us of our limitations, challenge our instincts, and invite reflection on what it means to be human. Even in a world dominated by science and technology, the symbolic vampire continues to evoke mystery, danger, and allure. In conclusion, the vampire's enduring legacy is a testament to its adaptability, universality, and psychological depth. From ancient folklore to modern subcultures, they reflect human fears, desires, and imagination. They entertain, instruct, and inspire, showing how myth can evolve while retaining core truths about human nature. As long as humans continue to grapple with mortality, morality, and desire, vampires will remain central to our cultural landscape, a shadowy, eternal presence that continues to haunt, fascinate, and enthrall.